starting with a basic static hamstring stretch. Static stretching is good for after athletic performance. It's the time that the muscles are still warm and you can get elongation in the fibers. You never want to do this prior to any athletic performance because it actually has shown to decrease muscle power output. You know, pickleball you're so much hinging at the waist. Your body's always so much forward, kind of like in basketball actually. So there's a few things that get tight, like hamstrings are a very common area that gets tight. Another one is the front of the hips. So we tend to start by stretching his hamstrings a little bit after we play. All right, so here we're gonna go a little bit further. Go ahead and bend this knee a little bit. By bending this knee, it puts a little slack in the system. So now what we can do is actually get a little ankle movement. So up and down with your ankle. So what happens when we move the ankle up and down is we're actually getting a little stretch on your nerve. People always think that when you stretch, you only stretch muscles, but you actually do get some neural tension if you put the whole system on stretch. And it's good to get a little bit of neural. You're doing what's called neural flossing. That's what you're doing right now. Tensioning and flossing. Yeah, like your teeth. Keep the nerves clean. Okay. We're going to finish this one with a little contract relax. So you're going to squeeze your quad and push your knee into me. Yep, and just hold that for about 8 to 10 seconds. And then go ahead and relax. So what we're doing here is we're activating the quad muscle. It's called reciprocal inhibition. So two muscles that do opposite functions in the body usually don't contract at the same time. So if the quad is active, it has to shut off the hamstring. Because the quad straightens the knee, the hamstring bends the knee. So if you squeeze here, in theory, your brain's going to shut off the hamstring, which is going to give you a little bit more flexibility. Yeah, so go ahead and squeeze the quad, push the knee. Yep, hold that. And usually when you hold that for 8 to 10 seconds, then as we release, it'll kind of melt a little bit further into the range.
How would you rank rates of flexibility 1 to 10 for your average person?
It depends where. So your posterior chain is a little bit tight, so it's an advantage. This is why you're so good. All right, so now that we've done that, we're going to go into a little bit of hip joint mobility. You know, when you are active on the court all day, it's not just our muscles that get tight. The joints take a lot of force and just impact throughout the day, so it's a good thing to get some joint mobilization, some gapping in the hip joints. Our hip joints are like a ball in socket, so we're going to do a little bit of gapping of his hips here. And we do that by pulling longitudinally on the leg. Give it a little oscillation. We can go through some range of motion with it. And usually here, Ben will feel a little bit of that hip just moving into that socket. And usually it feels pretty good. Not always, but he kind of felt that little release there. Another one there. Yeah, it's like, and so what he feels is there's actually, in the hip joint, there's a little rim that's called the labrum. And so when you put some distraction on there, what he feels, it's almost like a suction cup. And that's what he feels when I tug on it. It feels like there's a little pressure relief in that suction cup area. So here we're just kind of taking his hip through that motion. This is called a scour test, where that hip just gets to move through the range. A little end range external rotation. Usually internal rotation is less comfortable. So moving on here, we're doing a little bit of a end range knee mobility. The knee is a pretty simple joint in what motion it does, flexion, extension, but there's definitely a little bit of rotation in the tibia and the fibula, which is a smaller bone of the lower leg. So here we're kind of taking him to end range flexion with a little bit of tibia and fibula mobility. And Ben hasn't had trouble with his knees at all, but it's just good to keep him moving here and there. And then going down to the ankle, very important to have good ankle mobility, especially what's called dorsiflexion, which is pull your toes up, Ben, when the ankle bends this way, because that's one of the biggest predictor of being able to squat properly. Is if you have adequate ankle dorsiflexion, it's huge when you're performing a squat. That's what allows the tibia to move forward in the squat. And so in pickleball, for example, if you're at the kitchen line reaching for a volley and your ankles aren't moving well, it's going to restrict your reach, how much your hips can move back, how much you can go into that squat without being unstable. And of course, that all affects the shot. So again, we're just doing a little ankle joint mobility. This is what's called a talocrural joint mobility, where the ankle joint is like a dome-shaped joint, and the fibula and tibia kind of glide over it. So as we dorsiflex, this is getting a little technical, but as you dorsiflex your foot, that talus needs to glide posteriorly or towards the back, and so that's what we're kind of just mobilizing that talus down as I'm dorsiflexing this foot. And then same kind of thing as the hip, we can do a little distraction of the ankle. Yeah, a little release there, that felt pretty nice. Yeah, and that gaps his talocrural joint a little bit. Anterior chain, stretching and flexibility, so we're working on his quad in front of the hip here. Very important to keep the front of the hip and upper quad loose. Anytime the hip flexors get tight, hip flexors are actually a very unusual, it's an unusual muscle. So it consists of two different muscles, the psoas major and the iliacus, which is why it's called the psoas. Most people refer to the hip flexor as the psoas. There's a couple muscles involved. And what happens with the hip flexor muscle is that it actually attaches to the pelvis, but also goes all the way up into the lumbar spine, which is the lower back. And depending on your position of your spine, it has two different actions. So it can actually bend your spine forward or bend your spine backward, depending on what degree your hip is flexed, which is kind of interesting. But either way, if it's too tight, it can put excessive stress on the lumbar spine and create problems down the line. So by elevating the thigh and getting a little pressure on the lower back and bringing the ankle back, he feels a pretty strong stretch on his quad and upper hip. Is that right, Ben? Can't just take my word for it. Okay, relax. Good. Relax here. And you stretch there. And see now, he doesn't feel much stretch at this point. So, job well done. Next portion is to deal with the joints of the spine a little bit. The spine has to move. It's very, very important for human motion to have a properly mobile spine. And so here we're just going to do what's called some posterior to anterior mobilizations of the spine, starting at the base of the lumbosacral junction, and we're just going to go up the chain. A few things happen when you mobilize the spine. One is you get what's called a neurophysiological response, so it actually helps to decrease pain, and you will get some muscle relaxation just by mobilizing the joints of the spine. So Ben doesn't have an injury right now, but it doesn't matter. It's just good to keep him nice and mobile throughout the spine. Not only that, but not only centrally on top of the spine, but also on each side of the spine. We have bony prominences that are called transverse processes all up and down the spine. And so by pushing to one side or another, we can get a little bit of rotation into his spine and mobilize it in that direction. Another important part is the ribs. People don't think of the ribs as contributing to much sometimes, but mobility in the ribs is essential to good movement in the thoracic cage, which allows us to breathe properly. So breathing is obviously a huge component of athletic performance. And so keeping the ribs mobile will ensure that the diaphragm can do its job and inflate those lungs as much as we need them to. Last thing we're going to do here is just kind of take his shoulders through some range. Obviously, Ben being a right-handed player, right shoulder does more work, but you know, he has a two-handed backhand, and it's important to keep the left side mobile as well. You never know when you're going to switch hands and do that two forehands you used to have in tennis. People think our heads are kind of not supposed to move much, but the neck is crucially important how much it moves. Anytime your body is stationary and you turn your head either to track a ball or something, super important to have good neck mobility. Any tension in the upper neck and upper traps can certainly go all the way down the chain and cause some problems. So anytime we assess the body, we kind of start centrally, which is the spine, and we go out to the extremities, and starting with the neck is definitely very important. That's kind of where the chain starts. So we need good mobility for proper movement and all that there. And Ben's neck moves beautifully.
Let's go.
The muscles of his neck are not too tight, which means he didn't work too hard today, which is good. All right, that's gonna do it for today. And the Pickleball Doctor.
On a kick up lately is you ever tried a horseradish cheddar?
I have not tried horseradish cheddar.
People were getting on me so much about how most of that video was about sandwiches. The public is gonna have to deal with what I like.
However,
I like
a key to good stretching is being able to relax while you stretch, because otherwise you're
you
fighting
gotta do that
yourself.
by talking.
You only can do that
That's right.
by
I'm
talking about
breathing so
sandwiches.
well right now. Sandwiches relax me more than anything else.
What else could you wish for?
Explanation. Elastic means it's going to snap back into shape. If you're beyond the plastic range, it means it's going to stay elongated. And we love that for our muscles. We might not love that for some materials and parts, because then we might be going towards failure, but muscles are great. You know what my favorite example of inelastic is? Silly putty.
Silly putty.
Perfectly inelastic.
It'll
always retain the shape you give it.
There's going to be a meme coming out of this probably, but you know what?